Hello again and welcome to the latest Thursday interview here on Viking.TV with me, Anne Diamond. Are you planning your holidays yet? Do you know exactly where you want to go visit? Or do you wait to be inspired to something entirely new and unknown? Well, preparing to meet my next guest and reading the book she's just published about her own family background, I was absolutely captivated by some of the photos in it, like these. The most stunning photographs of the most brilliant landscapes. And then that got me Googling, as it always does. And I came across this one, just coming up next. Now, I've never seen or heard of it before, but it is apparently very famous. It's a European landmark, if not a world landmark, entirely created by Mother Nature, sometimes referred to as the Eye of the Earth. It is the Cetina, I think I've said it right, river source, or the Eye of the Earth. And you can't look at that photograph without wanting to witness it with your own eyes, can you? Nor any of those photographs. It is the source of the river Cetina, which flows from that source near a village of the same name, along a 100-mile route down to the Adriatic Sea. So that is now certainly on my wish list. But there are so many other wonderful places in a country few of us know very much about. And that is where my next guest comes in, because to her, this breathtaking part of the world is her home from home. And now she's a specialist in travel to Croatia and Serbia and the countries around which make up the former Yugoslavia, if you like. But this book, called My Family and Other Enemies, is so much more than a travel guide or history. It's a story of a country, its people, and one family. Sometimes heartbreaking, sometimes fascinating, often as exhilarating as the countryside in which it is set. So please welcome my next guest. It's author Mary Novakovich. Hello and welcome. Lovely to see you.
Thank you very much. I'm very, very happy to be here, Anne.
Well, tell us about your family and your roots in a place called Lika.
That's right. Yes. Both my parents were born there. And in fact, my family comes from Lika for generations. And I think before then it was somewhere in Bosnia. And before then, my father's family back in, I think, the 14th century came from Montenegro. So we're fully Slavic all the way back, both sides of the family. But Lika was where we have the family history that I know most about, because before then we're looking at early 18th century, 17th century before then. We just don't have the records for it anymore. So I can't really go any further back than that.
No, well, as we will discover, as you tell us more about, it's a very complex place with a complex history. Can we look first at the lovely picture of your mother?
Oh, yes. My mother, Jelka.
Stunning picture. When was that taken?
Not entirely sure. It was she left what was then Yugoslavia to come to London in 1955, and so she would have been 20. But here she was still in Yugoslavia, and she would have been late teens, maybe about 20. But you can see the same sort of. I got her cheeks.
Yeah, there's no doubt you're her daughter. And at the picture you have of your father. Now that looks almost like a prison photograph. What's going on there?
Refugee camp.
Ah.
Yes. He ended up in Germany for a while. First he was in Italy and then in Germany, and then he came to London. Actually, well, first he was in Scotland in the days when they were welcoming post-war refugees from all over Europe to the UK. He started off, he and his cousins were working on farms in Scotland. And then came down to London, and he ended up he actually found very good work in London, working for the BBC.
Oh my goodness!
Yes, yeah.
So he and your mother were born in the same region?
Yes, about 50 kilometers apart, but they never knew each other then. They didn't know, and because in those days, 50 kilometers, you might as well be in the next country. It's people didn't really travel, and so they ended up separately. My father in 47, my mother in 55, and happened to meet in London because there's such a big Serbian community was growing by that point, and everyone instantly knew each other because people sort of stuck together and helped each other out, and they happened to meet and got married.
My goodness. Okay, that starts to explain the complex history of your background. But we've got some lovely other old photographs there. Now, who's there?
Right. My father is the one standing in the front to the right, and his brother Dushan, and his to this left, the little one on my grandfather Rada's knee, and behind is my uncle Yobo. And again, that was taken probably when my grandfather died in 1933. And so that was just before then, because my father was born in 1926, so he wouldn't have been very, very old then. And
So that photograph again would have been taken in Lika.
Yes, definitely. Yes, they hadn't left Lika until they left Yugoslavia. If you see what I mean, they never left the region at all. And as you can see, my father's, his very impoverished, and kids didn't wear any shoes. At that point, my grandfather was a station master. Briefly, he was a station. They were initially farmers, and again, everyone who knows the full story, they're all dead. I got some snippets of information from my father's last remaining sister until she died, and I didn't even know that my grandfather had been a station master in the town called Gospic, which is the biggest town in Lika and the county seat.
Yes, that's the sort of capital of Lika, isn't it?
Yeah. It is, yeah.
I've been learning more about the geography of this in the last 24, 48 hours than I've ever known. And then we've got another lovely black and white photograph as well.
Yes. That's my grandmother, my mother's mother on the left, my Baba, we call Baba for grandma.
Baba is, right.
Yeah, and my aunt Dara, and so my grandmother's niece. And my Aunt Dada's story is one that I tell in the book, which is quite harrowing because she was the only survivor of a massacre in 1941. And because at that point, to get briefly into the very, very complicated history, 1941, when the Nazis invaded and the Croatia had an independent puppet state, a Nazi puppet state, run by the Ustaša. And the Ustaša immediately set about slaughtering Serbs, Jews, and Roma all throughout Croatia. And so they would just go through villages and sweep through them and just take everybody, take them onto lorries, throw them into pits, shoot them, slaughter them, take them off to, had a couple of death camps. They weren't concentrated death camps really, that they built in Croatia. And the slaughter was quite extraordinary, so much so that even the local Nazi commanders were saying, now, it's a bit too brutal, and it even shocked the Nazis, which is quite extraordinary. That's one side of Croatia's history, which is not terribly well known, and but it is very part. It's an important part because that then led to that helped stoke the fear in the early 90s when Yugoslavia was then falling apart.
I think that's what's so poignant about the story you tell in the book is that happy families, yes, there were. The human beings were happy and trying to just live a normal life. But the unbelievably complex politics and the atrocities that came with that politics of all of the different countries around vying for position for so many years, if not centuries, came even to play on your family. One more photograph I think we've got from these very early ones. These very early black and white ones, I think, show you and your uncle Ilya, who I think was very important to you.
Oh no, actually, my uncle Ilya is the one. Obviously, the only boy in the photo. My mother is one on the left, and my grandmother obviously is in the centre. And my mother's only sister Nedja, who she was killed by lightning when she was 14.
What?
Yes, I know. She survived the war, and it was just one of those absolutely horrendous things that happened to the family. And but I think we're talking about my uncle Ilya, not to be confused with my mother's grandfather Ilya.
Ah, I might.
And he was the one who had Ilya is one of the most common names in Croatia, especially amongst the Serbian enclave, which my family's Serbian, and so everybody's called Ilya. And I've got so many cousins and aunts and uncles. My uncle's called Ilya, and my great grandfather was called Ilya, and he was the one who had an interesting backstory, and he left just before the First World War because otherwise he would have been drafted in the Austro-Hungarian army and fighting against his own people.
Yeah.
So he went to Pennsylvania and he worked in the coal mines and trained to be a barber and played poker in his spare time and made quite a lot of cash. And after a few years, when it was safer to come back to then Yugoslavia, he built a big house, and he brought back. He fell in love with motorbikes, and he brought back some motorbikes and a 2-ton truck. and a typical returning migrant is like, here's my big house, and here are all my new toys. Absolutely. Yeah, he was quite a character. I never knew him. He died in the late 60s. Oh. And my mother has such fantastic memories of him. And again, one of these brilliant characters.
I know, it's one of those things when you delve into a personal memoir like this, you find yourself getting to know characters that, oh my goodness, if only you'd met them. Oh. It must have been very frustrating in a way, but also absolutely lovely getting to know people you never knew.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I wish. Apparently, this great grandfather of mine had buried a cache of gold somewhere on my mother's old land. No idea.
I found it.
Yeah, I need to borrow the detectorists in there.
Yeah, but also, and of course we see this, don't we, in some of these television programs where they delve back into people's backgrounds, and you find a name, and then you hear their story, and you actually can be very emotional for them. Was it when you did that yourself, when you looked back into the family, some of whom you never knew, was it a very emotional process?
It was indeed, yes. And it was part of it was remembering snippets of stories that my mother had told me when I was growing up, because what we had set out to do for one of the visits, all throughout the book, I chronicle every time I've been traveling in Lika, since 1976 when I first went, to 2019, just before the pandemic. And so my mother the idea was for her to tell me her stories during the war, which are quite, again, a combination of, the practicalities of living in a war-torn country when you've got, so many enemies, and also, the harrowing things, and just basic day-to-day things, trying to survive, who looks after your crops when you're fleeing the Germans, and all of that sort of stuff. And so that was being on the spot, where it all happened. And that brought such poignancy to everything she was telling me, because I get another story where the story about my aunt being the only survivor of the massacre, and the person who died with her was my great grandmother, and who I never knew, but I ended up sitting in her house, and I didn't know her house is the only one standing out of all of my grandparents and my parents. Nothing is still used or lived in. They're all either completely gone or just in utter ruin, and yet that house is still there. So I was in the spot where she died and where she was born.
So you were able to sit in her house?
Yes, because one of my mother's cousins still lives there.
Oh my goodness! And is that where she was killed?
Yes, she was. Yeah, she was murdered along with about 70, 80 other people that night. That my aunt managed to survive that by being in that pit for 10 days on her own.
Difficult. That's very difficult to get your head around.
Yeah, it is.
Is there something extraordinary about Lika people? Because you've got Lika blood going right through your veins, right? Yeah, I mean, is there something about Lika people? If anyone watching now said, all right, I want to go to Lika and meet the people, what would you want them to know before they got there?
We're a stubborn lot, and quite a combination of being tough as old boots, because with such a complicated and tempestuous history for centuries, there is a great toughness about the people, but also the biggest spirit, the biggest heart. I mean, everywhere you go, you're just offered food and water. I mean, food and drink rather, namely rakia, plum brandy and all that, and they won't leave you alone until you've been thoroughly fed and watered. And they're just so incredibly generous to the extent where you feel guilty taking things from people who have nothing, but they give everything they have to you. Yeah. And essentially just don't say no, because otherwise, I have a tip, which is if you do go there, just wear loose-fitting clothes, because you'll just be fed, because they can't abide to have hungry people on their doorstep.
So for the benefit of probably most of the people watching right now who've never been to Lika, let's paint the background to this whole story, actually, if we can, because very few people are acquainted with the history, and even those who think they are don't really understand it as much as a family like yours would. So in Europe, where are we focusing our sights? Let's look at a map. if we can. Now, everybody will recognise the boot of Italy. Where is Croatia? It is on the other side. And it has an enormous expanse of, well, of beaches, basically, of sea coast, doesn't it?
Mm. Mm. Well, the Adriatic coast is one of the things that people are drawn to in Croatia. It is, I think it's one of the most spectacular coasts in the world. I mean, I love it to bits. I'm not exactly the most neutral person about the Adriatic, but it is endlessly beautiful, spectacular. It's so, there's so much to it, and every little bit of it, you go from one island to the next, and they're so different. They might have similarities, especially further in Dalmatia. Actually, a lot of the Adriatic was part of the Venetian Empire. So when you go to the places that people would know about, for example, say Hvar, Brač, and Korčula, and Dubrovnik for that matter, and you see the same sort of geography and architecture. So you'll see the lovely pale creamy stone houses and green shutters and terracotta rooftops, and those are so typically Venetian, and they're also very typically Croatian along the Adriatic, along the Dalmatian coast, and further north in the Kavarna Gulf, and that's what it has a pleasing sort of familiarity about it, but it just has its own personality, definitely, even though it has so much of Venice in its history. You know, several hundred years of being part of the empire.
Anything from Venice to, you know, mountainous slopes with, I know you've been skiing there too, haven't you? If we look again at the map, whereabouts, if you can just describe vaguely, whereabouts is Lika?
Right, now you see the part of Bosnia, which is the furthest, the westernmost bit of Bosnia.
Yes, yes.
And then you just sort of take that whole bit down to the red route showing the road going through.
Yeah.
And that pretty much covers Lika. Until you get, and you see Zadar, which a lot of people might know about because it's a popular cruise port as well. But Zadar isn't part of Lika, but it's sort of, yeah. I'm just trying to look at the close up of that. Yeah, so there's Plitvice Lakes, which is the place that people do.
We have got pictures of that coming up. Yes,
yes.
It's a spectacular countryside. I'm told it has a unique sort of culture and dialect of its own.
Well, every part of that whole region will have, different islands will have their own dialect, and within Lika as well, there are so many phrases, and also between Croatia and Bosnia and Serbia, accents, dialects, obviously alphabets, and the Cyrillic and the Latin. Although Latin is in Croatia, apart from certain bits where they still have some Serbian signs. And yeah, so you have, I mean, even different words for bread, which is unusual, but and different words for the months of the year between Croatian and Serbian and Bosnian and Montenegrin. And so you have, I think because for so many centuries, so much of that area was very isolated. And as you find in rural France, for example, before industrialization and people, moving around, and, people had their own, so many dialects, and those languages dying out. And I suppose similar thing happening in the former Yugoslavia is that a lot of those, the more obscure dialects, they are going because aging population and the language is being forgotten. Although obviously the language is being spoken, Croatian and Serbian and Bosnian, they're all very, very healthy.
Yes, absolutely. But I mean, where visitors now visit and call it Croatia, were your parents, for instance, when they were brought up there, was it Serbia? Was it Croatia? Was it Yugoslavia? What was it then?
Well, my father was born in 1926, and at that point, it was still the kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. And Yugoslavia didn't wasn't created until 1929. So when my mother was born in 1935, it was Yugoslavia. And in fact, when my grandmother was born in 1913, it was still the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Crumbs.
And then in 1991, when Croatia became independent, and then it was Croatia. And then Slovenia and Croatia were the first two to break away from Yugoslavia. And then it was Bosnia, and then, Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia as well. Mustn't forget Macedonia.
And as soon as you hear any of those terms, you remember fighting and wars, which involved people like your family too, and terrible, terrible times. So in the end, your parents decided to up sticks and go to Canada?
Yes, after being in London for a few years, and which is a bit of a shame because my father, he had, for someone who had to learn English really, really quickly, and he did. He had a facility for languages, which was wonderful. And he was working as a lighting technician at BBC and also doing some freelance work with J. Arthur Rank and working on film sets in Pinewood. And he gave that up, and I'm not entirely sure why. I think there was something he was trying to enroll in. I think there was some sort of, I'm not entirely sure, again, whether my father died in 1989. So so many of these things are just a bit too sketchy.
I know, and don't you wish you had interviewed him?
Sorry?
Don't you wish you had interviewed him?
Oh, gosh, yes, absolutely.
Sat him down and asked him his story and written it down.
I know, I did to a certain extent. Not enough. I know. Get the stories while you can. That's the lesson to be learned today. And but so I think also because some of his close family had already gone there and he was missing them. And I think also London in the 50s wasn't exactly the lovely scintillating place it is now. It was filth. My father came, he was telling me about coming home with black face because of all the fog, the soot, the coal dust, and wondering why everyone was wearing a moustache. It's like, and they looked in the mirror, it's like, I've got one too, and that's the coal dust. And it was post-war, there was still rationing. And I think he just had enough of it, whereas Canada was being, hailed as this, big, clean country. And my mother was quite reluctant. She would have rather stayed. She says to me so many times, imagine how much our house in Hammersmith would be worth if we kept it.
But interestingly, they moved to Canada, which is where you were born and brought up.
Mm-hmm.
But the family still in the house anyway spoke Serbian.
Oh, yes.
I gather you only really learned to speak much English when you were actually sent to school.
That's right. Yes, because it was the lingua franca, the home. I mean, my grandmother lived with us at times as well, so she never officially learned English, although she could understand a lot more than she would let on occasionally. But then when I was the third of three children, and by the time I came along, we were still speaking Serbian all the time, but speaking English a little bit. And then when I did start school, that's when English started to become more the language of the home, apart from with my grandmother, obviously, and with elderly relations and friends of the family. And I did speak it all the time, but unfortunately it didn't develop as well as I'd liked it to.
So the next pictures we see in the book are of you when you were back in something like 1976, taken back to Croatia to meet Croatian family. So was that just a deliberate attempt to let's go back there and introduce you to the family?
It was indeed, yes. My parents wanted me to sort of go back to my roots, and it was a common thing to do, to send kids off for the summer to their grandparents or to the family. We're all over the world. You have people who grow up with memories of being at yes, that's me in my father's region, and I was 11. You can see how miserable I was looking, and I was like definitely fish out of water. Oh gosh, it was such a culture shock. It really was. You can see that, and I was living in a city, and I was surrounded by nothing but wilderness and tiny mountain villages, and I was lucky that I was staying with my aunt and uncle. I was shipped there on my own. And I didn't really know anyone there. It was the first time I'd met my aunt and uncle once, and that was it. And they had come to Toronto, and I was,
they didn't have a word of English, did they?
No, not at all, no. And I thought I'd had decent Serbian, and I realised when I got there, no, there was so much English in my Serbian, and it was really hard work to make myself understood and to understand what was being said to me. But kids are like, kids' brains are like sponges, and it wasn't long before the fog lifted and I could understand and I could speak, and I was thinking and dreaming in Serbian, before too long, and dreaming in it, and and I learned how to write in Cyrillic, which is brilliant. Wow. Very, very handy skill to have. I still use that. And we obviously, I go to Serbia, or even reading, Russian and Bulgarian signs, and I can read the Cyrillic. I can make out most of the letters, even if I can't understand them. And so it was a brilliant way to, I recommend wholeheartedly total immersion. Just throw a child in the middle of nowhere and just make them learn the language.
They say it works, yeah. But if I ask you now, I mean, is it possible to answer the question, what made you fall in love with Croatia? Because that's clearly what you did.
I did indeed. The landscapes. I mean, initially they were so intimidating because they were just so wild and so rugged, and it was
Your mum,
completely.
yeah, I think
Yes, that
one of
was
the
it.
reasons.
Yes, that was a trip that we did in 2004. We were hiking the Velebit Mountains in front of the Adriatic, and yes, and that was that's the sort of, I mean, part of the landscapes. Initially, the region that my mother came from, I think the first image that you showed of a vista was all very, very green, and that's my mother's region. And whereas my father's was the one that shot of me in front of a really very scrubby land, and that's my father's region. So they're only 50 kilometers apart, but it's like going across a continental divide. Yes, that's my mother's area, and you can see how wonderfully lush and green it is. And then you drive, an hour away, and you're in this scrubland. But it's the same mountain range that goes all the way down to Albania, the Dinaric Alps. And it's the same landscape that you see if you're in Dubrovnik, for example. Those mountains that are really quite barren but still beautiful, that hover over the city. That's the same mountain range. And
I mean, it is utterly spectacular. It doesn't matter what region you choose of Croatia to see. I gather that's your mountain.
That's my mountain. Yes, that was a view I had from my aunt and uncle's house, and I fell in love with that mountain as soon as I saw it, and I named it that's my mountain, and it always be my mountain.
It's a perfect mountain, and that looks gorgeous as well. But the thing that also struck me of many of your pictures are of the unbelievable waterfalls and rivers and lakes. That's when you near the source of the Una River.
Yes.
It looks as though you've just dropped a pebble into the source there.
Yes, my husband caught that beautiful moment with the water rippling like that, and the Una it's one of the there's a source. Yeah, it's one of those. It's a river that forms a natural border with Bosnia for part of its flow, and it's one of those. People who live by the Una has a sort of mystical hold on the imagination, and I think they say that the Romans named it Una, the only one, because it was unique in its beauty. And I never get tired of being by the water. This is taken from the Bosnian side of the river, and it's astonishingly beautiful, and it's so clean and so pure. And so many waterfalls and canyons, and then broader sides of it where it's much more open. Yes, like water rafters. They're completely bonkers, these people. Yes. They actually jump after they throw the raft. They then jump in the water after that.
But that's the thing about many of the rivers, I gather, in Croatia and in that countryside around, is that you have these beautiful, tranquil lakes, beautiful rivers, and then suddenly you have waterfall upon waterfall upon waterfall upon waterfall, and it's stunning.
Yeah, it is. It is. It really is such a combination of sort of incredible drama with that, and then also tranquility, because you just look at that water and you go, oh, you just sort of relax when you're looking at it, but you're standing in front of it. Oh yes, there's a little waterfall, little canyon near my uncle's house, and just the water in there, and you've got water snakes at your feet. But I have no problem with snakes, and they're not, they don't bite you at all. But just diving into that water when it was just the right side of bracing, and it was.
That's an interesting phrase, the right side of bracing. We've got some lovely video, I know, as well, from Viking Zone videos of the stunning waterscapes that you see when you're there. It just looks like droplets of water, and then suddenly you see that it's gushing from small water sources and then becoming huge, amazing rivers, and, as we were saying, waterfalls. And it is clearly something that, that's unbelievable. It is unique, and would be on anyone's must-see list. As a travel writer yourself now, you must say to people that you just can't, even the pictures don't do it enough justice. You've got to go see, haven't you?
Oh, absolutely, yes. And that looks like Kurka. Is that what you've got?
I think that is Kurka, yeah.
Yes.
And now we're out on the sea, actually, as well, and being able to see these amazing landscapes from the sea. Coming round to a place like, for instance, Dubrovnik there, which is unescapable, isn't it?
Yes.
And again, being able to go inside as well. There's so much variety of things to see.
Absolutely. In fact, you just showed walking the city walls, which I've done so many times over the years, and I never get tired of doing it. If you are in Dubrovnik, you have to walk the city walls.
Yes.
They really are just, it's a fantastic, everything about walking around the top of it, looking down into everyone's, the gardens and the homes, and then looking out at the sea and all the different towers around the walls as well. And just, I mean, that view, and yeah, I never get tired of it. In fact, I'm off to Dubrovnik next week.
Oh, next week! How wonderful! No, I mean, absolutely. I saw it only a few months ago, and never seen anything like it at all. And again, the pictures don't do it justice, even though they're wonderful, because it is like stepping back into, gosh, how many hundreds of years of history, and it's been perfectly kept. Absolutely brilliant.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, well, it's on the UNESCO list, and you can see why, because it's, even though it was shelled stupidly by the Serbs during the 90s war, and there's no reason for them to do it at all, and it shouldn't have been done. But it was at least you could see where they managed to repair very, very quickly afterwards. They didn't take them.
Absolutely stunning. Exactly. I was saying when I was last, or before the last time I was there, was 95, when everything was pockmarked with bullet holes. I am astonished by how well it has been rebuilt, almost as though it never happened, although obviously one never forgets the history. But it is still a spectacular place to go again now. Very friendly, awfully good for shoe shops, I have to say. I mean, much more than that too. I mean, and the people are still very warm and friendly.
Oh, definitely. As I said before, even in Dubrovnik, which is, as you know, it's the most visited place in Croatia, and everyone wants to go there. And at the height of the season, it can get very busy, and that it's, everyone's rushed off their feet, everyone working there, and it's really hard work. But when you catch them when they can catch their breath. And they just want to make certain that you're having a good time, and really, especially, a lot of tour operators and guides who are looking after you while you're there, and they just want to show you the best of their country, because they are, very justifiably proud of it.
Oh, and Game of Thrones hasn't done it any harm either, has it?
Yes, I've never actually watched a single.
I don't know Game of Thrones very well, but my sons all watch it. And the minute we went there, it was, wow, I recognise this place. And it does take you back into sort of a fantasy history as well as a real one.
Yeah. I think it has enough history of its own, actually. That Game of Thrones.
Shop if you're not careful. So tell us more about the real traveller stuff then, because you are the ultimate travel writer. Food and wine. Now, I've got some pictures of food that you showed us, and I can't even pronounce their names. But there's one we've got here called cevačići.
Cevačići.
Oh, cevačići.
Cevačići.
Cevačići. Now, what is that?
It's little meat rissoles, and it's either beef or beef and pork, depending on where you are, and they're grilled, and you serve them. You can see that the red pepper relish beside that. It's called ivar, and it's generally red pepper and aubergine, and that's a very, very popular condiment, and then with red onions as well, and it's quite often served in a very fluffy flatbread called lepinja. And cevačići, it's a staple food. It's like going to the US and having burgers. I mean, actually, they have burgers, their own version of burgers as well. But it's soul food, really. It sounds like a very common thing to eat, but I never get tired of eating it. And it does taste absolutely fantastic. It's packed with spice, a lot of cayenne pepper and paprika. Paprika's a lot of paprika in Balkan food in general.
All right, cevačići.
Cevačići.
Cevačići. Let's remember. Burek.
Burek, yeah.
Burek.
Oh God, again, anything with phyllo pastry, it has my heart. Burek is again a sort of pan-Balkan food, and it's one of the best street foods you can ever have. And it's either, as that picture was, made in a coil, or it's made in a huge flat, huge, like a pizza, a round pie, and then cut into tranches. And it's the old optimum. Actually, I think every country that had phyllo. So the Ottoman Empire brought an awful lot of sort of Turkish food into that whole region. But then you find that in the different forms in Central Asia, in North Africa. But burek itself, that thing is everywhere from Albania through all the old ex-Yugoslavia, and everyone loves burek. And one of the nicest things to have it is with drinking yogurt.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and you have it either with spinach, rather like the Greeks have their own version of that as well. The spanakopita, but it's either with cheese or meat or spinach or a bit of cheese and spinach together.
All right, so we can show off if we stop in a street shop. So ciabattacci, burek, and prosciutto.
Prosciutto, yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's air dried ham, exactly that. Yes, and if you're there's a famous wind that howls down the Adriatic called the Bura, and in Italy, in Trieste and Slovenia, it's called the Bora, and that's what gives prosciutto its essence, because it sweeps it down the Adriatic coast, and so you have whole chunks of pork that are air drying, and that it takes the flavor of the Bura. And further down in Dalmatia, they often have it smoked as well. So in Istria in the north, it's just air dried, and further south it's usually smoked, and it's sliced as thinly as possible, and it just it's wonderful, just melts in the mouth.
All right, I'm going to show off with those. I'm going to make a note. And of course, oysters is the other thing you have to mention when you're talking about a lot of places along the Dalmatian coast and the Croatian coast. Let's have a look at how they farm oysters with one of our own videos here with Viking's own Karina Hagen. Have a look at this.
In quiet bays along Croatia's coast, just below these buoys, are oysters, lots of them. And today I'm out with my friend Pero to learn more about how these delicacies are farmed.
So here you have both mussels and oysters.
And oysters.
So these have been in the water for how long?
These are oysters from 1 to 3 years old.
1 to 3 years old.
This one is 1 year old. And this is the first part of production. What we do every year, in June, July, each oyster are listing 1,000 of little eggs around the bay. We put these tiny nets as a collectors, and we're waiting these oysters to connect on this net, like this, you see? This is 6 months old, you see how small it is. So this is the first part of production. In 1 year, it gets grown approximately 5-6 centimeters. Then what we do, we take them off from these ropes, like this. This is 1 year old, you see, 6 centimeters.
Yeah, when it's 1 year old, you remove it from the net?
Yes, we remove it. Like this. And then we put in cement. We put a little bit cement on each oyster and left the rope in the middle.
Okay, so you glue 2 oysters to the rope with a bit of cement.
Yes. And then we're waiting for 2 more years so we can start sell them.
So they're ready at 3.
At 3.
This type of oyster is called
Ostraedulis.
Ostraedulis.
Ostraedulis, which means flat oyster.
Flat oysters, yes, because they're much flatter than the ones I'm used to.
Flat, and it's very tasty kind. When you're eating this oyster, you can feel the taste of the nature of the sea.
Yeah, and it's very easy to eat them.
Yes,
because they're flat.
Very easy.
So
and you don't need any ingredients.
No.
Just a fresh oyster.
Yeah.
And
you're a fast shucker.
Yeah. This one is small.
Just like that? No lemon, no vinegar,
nothing.
No nothing.
This is the best.
I'm not sure how elegantly I can do this with these big gloves, but... Oh yeah.
Like that?
That's fresh.
No, rather her than me. They're fresh, she said. What about you, Mary? Are you into oysters?
Oh, I love them. Absolutely. I'm just salivating looking at that film. They must have been in Ston. Is that where they were?
I think so, yes.
Yes. Ston oysters are absolutely, they are just gorgeous. They've got this incredible sort of delicate sweetness to them, and they are, I love them. Whenever I see them on the menu, I'm in there. And also further north in the Istrian Peninsula, there's the Lim River, and that's another place where they have oysters. And because the waters of the Adriatic are so clean, and they're just washing the waters in the river in the estuaries, and having, I mean, just purely the taste of the sea, and they're just, oh God, wonderful.
Well, all right, okay. What about with all of those foods, the wine? Now, Croatian wine is now world famous. Can you recommend where we would go for wine? I think there are lots of places you can actually go and stay in a vineyard.
Well, yes. Oh gosh, so much of Croatia grows, makes wine. Apart from Lika, unfortunately, it has, the winters are too cold to sustain winemaking, unfortunately. But they make up for it in plum brandy. But yes, there's so many regions. Istria has got, I mean, a lot of great wine. Teran white, reds, and Malvasia white, and then you go along the coast, and practically every island will be making their own wine. And the places my favorite ones are in Korčula, which is again one of the most beautiful islands in the Adriatic. And they've got practically every island in Croatia has its own indigenous grape. It's found nowhere else. And in Korčula, they've got this one grape, a white wine called Gurk. And they're not very keen on vowels in the Croatian language. GRK, I know. And that is one of the best white wines I've ever had. And they make it only in one village, not even across the whole island.
Oh.
Lombarda on the eastern side of the island. And about 6 families in the village make it. And if you ever see Gurk on a menu, have it. It is superb. And there's also another white called Pošip, from the same island, and Plavac, which is a red grape, which they have both in Korčula and the Pelješac Peninsula, which sort of goes north of Dubrovnik and then sort of creeps into the Adriatic, and it's very, very close to Korčula. It's like a 20-minute quick, ferry across between the two, and that's one of the best areas for wine. And they have again, they've got Plavac Mali, a red grape, and Dingač, which is another really good red. And Pelješac is brilliant for just sort of pootling along the roads and stopping at the different wineries and doing tastings, and they do have farms that you can stay in, and where they make wine as well. And oh gosh, another place around Primošten, another winery called Babić, which is also very good. And Slavonia, which is continental Croatia towards the Hungarian border, that's probably the biggest wine region, and it's very different from the Dalmatian wines. And they have a lot of Graševina, which is white, which is the main wine there. And if you think about the neighboring countries, because Hungarian wine, huge industry there, Serbian wine, big industry there on the other side of the Danube, and same thing with Slavonia, in the region sort of between, if you take Zagreb and sort of go east and north, and that whole area, lots and lots of wine, fantastic stuff. And it doesn't get exported. Oh, obviously, some they do get exported, but it's not to a great extent, because they don't make enough to export to a large extent, and so you have to go to the country to drink it.
It really does sound almost as though wherever you parachuted down in the whole of the area, there would be a story, a history, food and wine and people that are almost unique to that place that you happen to be, which is what makes it so fascinating. And also a centuries-old history, centuries and centuries.
Absolutely.
So, silly question, I suppose, but what made you become a travel writer, or how did you get into it?
Well, funny enough, I was working. Soon after I went freelance, which was 1997, and a year later I was doing some regular freelance work for the Independent on Sunday. And I was chatting to the travel editor, who unfortunately died since then, Jeremy Attia, lovely, lovely man. And we were chatting about, the Balkans, because he loved the area. And he was fascinated by my background. I said, I want you to write for me. I said, yeah, of course. I won't say no. And I never did actually, I did write for him, but not about the Balkans, funny enough, not and then he left to go freelance. But so that sort of started my travel writing, which was back in 1999. And in combination with everything else that you do as a freelance in those days, I was mixing it with, I was doing loads of editing and music writing and book editing and everything you do as a freelance journalist. But the travel then really sort of took center stage about 6, 7, 8 years later. And now I do all travel.
Do you find yourself being invited to do things that you probably would never normally do, like pony trekking or cycling holidays or water sporting, or, well, I know you ski anyway. So do you have to almost be able to do any sort of holiday to be able to write about it?
Yes and no. There are ones when I realise it's something that it wouldn't particularly interest me, or I haven't got the courage. And especially as I get older, I realise, no, I'm a little bit past the age of being able to do, you know, X, Y, and Z. Apart from skiing, I'm still doing skiing, just hanging in there with these old knees. But some things I think, well, I know I haven't got the bravery to do that. And other times I think, yeah, I'll give it a go. And in fact,
such as,
well, I tried kayaking, which in Montenegro, which was brilliant fun to be on a boat doing that. But unfortunately, I was a bit rubbish at it. So I did give it a go. And what else have I?
I know you love writing about France because you say that you have lived in France on literally every day of the year. You know France.
I do. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I'm just thinking about what I've done in France. Actually, nothing. I haven't ridden a horse for years, because the last time I did nasty things to my back, so I can't do any more pony trekking, unfortunately.
But I know that you've also written articles about white wine and white beaches, which I think is very cool. That sounds nicer.
That was Portugal, actually. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, which it's still one of my favourite places. I want to go back as soon as I can.
It's very difficult then to recommend to anyone if you're only going to call into Croatia for maybe a few destinations. If you're, for instance, on a Viking cruise, I don't know, you may do Montenegro, you may do Dubrovnik, somewhere else, maybe Split. What are your top tips for just getting the most out of it? Is it easy to say?
It all depends on the itinerary, I suppose, and how long you're docked at each destination, and what you really want to get out of it, and getting. I think a lot of it depends on doing a lot of research beforehand and seeing what is there, and having an idea of how much you can, physically and emotionally take in without overwhelming yourself.
I saw one of your top tips, which was be prepared for lots of bare flesh, because there are lots of naturist beaches in Croatia.
Oh, there are. Yes. In fact, if you go to Dubrovnik, one of the loveliest things I like doing is they have a little 10-15 minute boat ride from the old port to the island of Lokrum, which your son's Game of Thrones fans would know very well, because that's actually, they have got the throne there if you want to sit in it. Ooh. But there's also a naturist beach. And if you ever see the sign letters FKK, that means it's a naturist beach, and that's the German abbreviation for something about freedom, being free with your nature, or whatever it is. I don't know what it stands for. And because a lot of Germans have been coming to Croatia for decades now, and they do like their naturism.
Okay, so that's really worth knowing. Also, be careful what you say about the war out loud, because you never know who you're in the company of, do you?
Absolutely.
The feelings about it, because the war was, not very long ago.
No, it wasn't at all. I mean, I'm very wary of bringing it up, and especially with my background as a Serb.
Yeah.
And I make certain that we get to know each other before, people might want to ask me something, or I might ask them something, but I'm very, very circumspect about it, because I never know when I'm going to have someone immediately back off saying, you're a Serb, because some people might do that. I might be offended just by being in their presence, because if they experience something absolutely, utterly horrifying that I can't even imagine, then they think anyone who's Serbian, they don't want to be there. And I can understand that. So I'm very, very careful who I talk to, and that I don't, thrust my Serbianness, as it were, on them.
You just never know who you're talking to, or the sensitivities, or who lost who, or whatever. You just don't know. I mean, and that's what I find so achingly difficult about talking about it, having looked at those wonderful pictures, that incredible landscape, the beautiful people, and knowing that war was only, a couple of decades ago, horrible, terrible war. It's difficult to come to terms with it, isn't it?
It is absolutely. And I find that people I've been talking to, they some of them just think, okay, we just get over, just get on with life. You know, don't keep on dwelling on it. And then other people on different sides of the various conflicts try to do a bit of revisionism. And either they are denying what happened or they rewrite what happened. And that's one of those things that I have absolutely no patience with at all, because I know that, you know, Serbs like to minimize or even ignore what they've done, and Croatians as well, and in certain places. And it's something that you have to have, you know, have your ears and eyes open to, and know that when someone says something like that, or if they happen to explain a bit of history, not always to take them at their word, because you don't know what perspective they're talking from.
So coming full circle from the beginning of our talk, your own family, how did they deal with that? Or could you not even talk to them about the war?
Well, my father died before Yugoslavia fell apart, and my mother, she, well, it's difficult to remember really what we were talking about at the time, because when we were actually in Croatia together in 2004, that was the first time that both of us had been there together after the war, and she was very nervous because she said, well, they hate us because we're Serbs. And as it turned out, every single person we met were absolutely just wonderful. Absolutely just, they welcomed us, and we had no fear. But at the same time, you do go to parts of Croatia, if you're driving a Serbian car, you still have to be careful because of vandalism.
Yeah.
And so you have to. So my mother, I don't think I mean, unfortunately now she's at the stage where she's got dementia. We don't have those conversations now, unfortunately. And other people, I think they were too quick to say at the beginning, oh, Serbs couldn't have done that. It's our people, we couldn't have done that. And unfortunately, we did.
Yeah. I mean, wars weren't that long ago, any of the big ones, actually, but still such an amazing country. And thank God, peaceful at the moment, so that we can enjoy. How do you enjoy a holiday? If you're a travel writer, it's a bit like being a journalist who's completely, besotted with the news all the time. How do you ever find anywhere where you can switch off and think, I don't want to write about this, even though it's beautiful. I am not going to just experience this as a journalist. I'm just going to switch off. Is there anywhere you can do that?
Not really, no. I've actually done a few holidays. A few times I've gone on a holiday, a proper holiday. I end up writing about it afterwards. I don't. Yeah, I mean, I always keep a diary, a travel diary, anyway, and because you never know, at some point someone will go, oh, someone been to a Greek island, but recently, go, yeah, I've been there, So I don't switch off in that respect. But one thing I did do, I did a sailing holiday for a travel feature in the summer, and it was on one of those small boats, a mini cruiser. So it was 18 cabins. So really one of these little ones that go from island to island. And the thing I did manage to do to switch off was being on that boat as we docked every day and had a swim stop, and just lying there on the deck, staring at the beautiful water and at the landscapes and the edges of the islands that we were, docked in front of. And just being lulled into a state of bliss. And that was, I had no problems turning off for that.
Everybody should veg out.
Absolutely.
You must have been driven crazy during the global lockdown then.
Actually, I travelled quite a lot. I did. I managed, in fact, I went to Dubrovnik in July of 2020 when there was no one there.
Oh. And
that was absolutely astonishing, because they still had patches of grass growing between the cobbles, because they hadn't had footfall. And I'd never seen Dubrovnik like that. I'd even been there in November, and when it was, half the things were shut, and there was still a couple of cruise ships docked in the harbour. Obviously there's no cruise ships at all at this point, and it was beautiful. It was I'd never seen Dubrovnik quite that laid back before.
You chose your moment, didn't you?
I did, and I managed a trip to France as well. To Cap Ferret on the Atlantic coast, and I managed a trip to Greece as well, to Paxos, my favourite place.
So where are you off to next?
Dubrovnik.
Dubrovnik. Oh, that's just next week.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
And there is still something new to say about it, always.
Well, yes, I'm doing a series of hotel reviews in this one, but there's always something new. And the thing I find interesting about Dubrovnik out of season is out of season, and it is a very different atmosphere. The temperature, the forecast is still going to be. I mean, I was there in November when it was 18 degrees and blue skies, and when it's sunny, and the sea, you can still swim in the sea, and it's just, the atmosphere is just it's wonderfully laid back, and you can really appreciate the beauty.
So is that a good ultimate tip as well? Sometimes go quiet season, very quiet season.
Yeah, yes. There's quiet and there's really, really quiet. I mean, late November, when it's harder because a lot of places do, a lot of hotels and restaurants will close down for the season. And some might reopen a bit at Christmas, and others won't. They'll reopen at March or even Easter. Actually, February, there's a big carnival in Dubrovnik. And in fact, carnival, they have carnivals in different parts of Croatia, which is brilliant time to visit that point too. But yes, I mean, late September September is one of my favorite months to go away in the Mediterranean, because it's still summer in a way, and it's become a very popular time to go away, but it's not like being in the height of the school holidays in July and August.
It sounds like a brilliant lifestyle. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been absolutely fascinating. I've only got about a quarter of the way through it, but it's absolutely enthralling. Let me just recommend to everybody watching right now, it's called My Family and Other Enemies. Why is it called Another Enemies?
Well, My Family and Other Animals was one of my favorite books, and I couldn't resist the pun on the Gerald Durrell novel, and a book. Actually, it is part of it's fabricated, but anyway. And but yes, I my family, and if anyone who's in Croatia for long enough will have been an enemy at some point or another. So. That's
very true, unfortunately. Isn't it? But it's a lovely way to tell the story of a country and its civilization, and a bit of its history is through your family. It's been absolutely brilliant meeting you and hearing you tell us about it. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Anne. Thank you so much for having me.
And happy travelling.
Thank you.
So there you are. That is it for another week here on Viking.TV. I do hope you're safe and well and enjoying your holidays, or at least if you're not, anticipating the next one. Until we're together again, have a fab week. From me, bye-bye.